Hello. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to make a short presentation to this event, organized by the CERL Bookbindings Working Group, and I should like in particular to thank Per Coolhead for organizing it, and I look forward to meeting you all virtually when that happens. The binding I'm about to show you doesn't look like much. It's a lace case binding with a cover of calf parchment, with sewing support and end-band core slips laced through the joints. It's been knocked about a bit and it's certainly showing its age, but it is entirely typical of a binding of this period. And if you walk past it in a rare book library stacks, you might not even give it a second look. The book inside is a copy of a posthumous edition of a legal text by the French jurist Charles Dumoulin. It was printed in Paris in 1598 by Adrien Perrier, the second husband of Magdalena Plantin, the daughter of Christophe Plantin, the famous Antwerp printer and bookseller. Magdalena's first husband, Egidius Bayes, had published books at first in Antwerp and then from 1594 in Paris, at an address in the Rue Saint-Jacques, where he died in April 1595. In April 1596, Magdalena's daughter, Madeleine, was married to Jérémie Perrier, a bookseller also in the Rue Saint-Jacques. And 6 months later, Magdalena herself married Adrien Perrier, brother of Jérémie. As Léon Vauet put it in his study of the Plantin-Moretus printing house, Madeleine Bayes became her mother's sister-in-law, Jérémie Perrier the brother-in-law of his mother-in-law, while Adrien Perrier became both stepfather and brother-in-law to Madeleine Perrier. It's almost as complicated as the binding on this book, printed by Adrien Perrier the year before his wife died, and using the golden compasses in his printer's mark and the name of the illustrious company he had married into, in Officina Plantiniana. All of this is of significance to the study of this binding because the binding, which it might have been assumed could have been French, is very clearly Flemish underneath the cover and indicates that this book was shipped, quite possibly to Antwerp, in sheets where it was to be bound. It was sewn quite rapidly from left to right with a thin S-twist thread and a curious and irregular combination of all-along and bypass sewing, the needle regularly missing the spine folds on 4 thin double cords with straight, not linked, sewing. This combination of sewing support material and sewing technique would not, I believe, have been found in France, where linked sewing on thin alum-taured supports have been the norm throughout the 16th century, though by the 1590s perhaps single supports would have been more likely to have been used than double, but alum-taured skin in any case. The sewing supports were cut off at the joints, another feature unlikely to have been found in France. The end leaves follow a very common pattern across Northern Europe, or the whole of Europe pretty much, of a single fold of white paper within a parchment guard. The watermark, a Gothic P surmounted by a small 4-petal flower, lies across the fold of the left end leaf by folium and is, unfortunately for us, of a type that was in common use for at least 2 centuries across northwestern Europe, and is of little use in suggesting a provenance for the binding, and I've not yet been able to find anything approaching a close match. In my experience, end leaves with watermarks are often, at least the watermarks are often not very helpful. If you can find a match, it doesn't even necessarily tell you where the book was bound. Sometimes you can strike lucky, of course. A much more reliable clue to provenance lies in the boards and the method used to attach them to the sewn book block. A thin, 1 millimeter thick grey-brown board, a very typical color for a Flemish board, was attached to the sewn book block by adhering it to the inner side of the outer element of the guard. And this use of an end leaf guard to attach a board to a book block is a very Flemish practice. It renders the sewing support slips redundant, which is why they could be cut off without compromising the structure. It may be that this was also done because cords do not work well when laced through parchment, and binders seem generally to have avoided doing this. But books covered in leather and alum-taured skin from the same part of Europe, what is now Belgium essentially, share the same method of board attachment. In order to allow the cover to be turned in at head and tail, the binder cut the parchment guards at head and tail with a knife, as you can see at the red arrows. So far, so Flemish. But there are 3 things to be found on this binding that may not conform to typical Flemish work, not at least as I know it. Firstly, the book block was sewn from left to right, as can clearly be seen in the tail end kettle stitch, whose chevron pattern indicates the direction of sewing, as does the angle of the kettle stitch, pulling a fraction closer to the center of the spine as each kettle stitch is tied. The Germanic tradition, which Flemish binding seems mostly to have followed, typically sewed books in the opposite direction. The second feature that does not seem to me to be a very Flemish one is the type of spine lining that was used. A paper panel lining in each of the spine panels adhered with paste, which conformed to a very typically French usage for inexpensive bindings for much of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th centuries. This makes the binding, for me at least, hover rather indecisively between French and Flemish-speaking parts of the historically much disputed borderland of northern France and the southern Netherlands. An imprecision not to be resolved by the end bands, sewn in a double reddish-brown and blue thread from left to right, as indicated by the front bead, over cores of twisted alum-tawed skin with only 4 tie-downs. This is an end band that could, at this date, have been sewn almost anywhere in northwestern Europe, including England. And I find it very interesting when looking at books from parts of Europe which share different cultural traditions. This has a French element and a Flemish element in the Low Countries at this point, to see how this may or may not be reflected in binding structures. And here we have a binding that seems to combine both, which is perhaps not unexpected. The photograph of the spine, however, also shows a rather unexpected feature of this binding, which is lengths of white alum-tawed skin bound to the double cord sewing supports with a helix of thread. And this was quite neatly done and provided extensions at both joints. The slips, which along with the end band core slips, were used to attach the present lace case cover in a manner which is a complete contradiction of the structure to which the strips of alum-tawed skin were attached. So you've got a structure designed for one thing and then this addition turning it into something else. The end leaf guard board attachment replaced the role of sewing support slips in the Flemish tradition and allowed parchment covers to be folded around the book block and boards with only the end band slips laced through the joints of the cover and thus visible on the outside of the binding, as can be seen in this example printed in Antwerp in 1662. It shares, as you can see, boards of the same material as our binding and of the same type of end leaf guard attachment, and differs only in the horizontal knife cuts that allowed the parchment tabs at head and tail to be left unadhered to the boards in order to make space for the turn-ins of the cover, unlike the vertical cuts in the binding we've been looking at. When this book was finished, the 2 tabs at head and tail would be pasted down over the turn-ins, and then the outer end leaf would be pasted down over both as a paste down and hide them all from sight, though in neither this case or the one we're looking at did this actually happen. So this must have been the intended appearance of our book when it was sewn and the boards were attached. Only at some point early on, there was clearly a radical change of plan and one structural tradition was replaced by another. The question is whether we can ever know why, and above all, where this might have happened. And here we certainly enter the realm of hypothesis. I've been doing research for many years on what I call unfinished bindings made for the book trade. These could take the form either of sewn book blocks with neither boards or cover, or they could be bound in boards but still without a cover. Either way, the completion of the binding was left to the choice, and possibly the pocket, of the future owner. Once you accept that this practice was possibly quite widespread, it becomes possible to offer explanations for apparent anomalies presented by some bindings. So my hypothesis is that our book, which was printed in Paris, was shipped into the Franco-Flemish world, possibly Antwerp, given the printer's connection to the Plantin printing house. And of course, it's worth remembering that Christophe Plantin himself, a Frenchman by birth, was a bookbinder. And so French bookbinding practice in the Plantin house would not have been unexpected. It was shipped there in sheets, where it was bound up to the point of having boards and spine linings. In that state, it would have resembled a book now in the Herzog August Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel on a Bayreuth edition of 1660, which was bound in boards and left uncovered, though in this case with sewing support slips ready to be laced through a cover, had one ever been put onto it. In my hypothetical reconstruction, the book was then sold on to a purchaser living somewhere where the Flemish structure was not used, and the binder felt it necessary to add the additional strips of alum-tawed skin to the sewing support, to the cord sewing supports, with end bands also added, to provide slips to allow the cover to be laced on. This was perhaps done by a binder who felt that a book of this size needed the extra strength offered by the additional lacing. The new cover is of calf parchment, lined on the inside with 2 overlapping sheets of handmade laid paper, as neither sheet was quite wide enough to do the job on its own, with clearly marked and narrowly spaced spine and joint creases. The paper lining would have been used to both make the parchment less translucent and also to use the adhesive to soften the parchment for covering the book. The turn-ins are very narrow at head and tail, and with an unusually wide and untrimmed foredge turn-in on the left-hand side, still with some of the horny area of the edge of the skin visible. You can see at the lower end of the turn-in. And the paper linings bear the impressions of short, neatly trimmed ends to the sewing support slips. You can see this bottom right very clearly. And while none of these features, the narrow, sharply creased joints, the narrow turn-ins at head and tail, the neatly trimmed slips and the calf parchment cover, are individually unique to any one Northern European country, taken together, they are typical of English work of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. But apart from being bought in an English antiquarian bookshop, this book has no indication of provenance in the form of inscriptions, shelf marks, annotations, or library stamps, and too little of the manuscript title, unfortunately, survives to allow any attempt to place the hand of the manuscript in one country or another. The practice, however, of importing sewn book blocks into England from across the North Sea is evidenced by two other books. These two editions, one printed in Cologne in 1617 and the other in Rome in 1652, in limp lace case parchment covers in the library at Lambeth Palace, are in what are undoubtedly English covers. The use of polished calf parchment with narrow foredge cover extensions and the narrow joints in the cover, as well as the heavy application of glue on the spine of the Cologne edition, you can see at the bottom, are all typically English. The sewing supports on neither volume, however, are long enough to have been used for lacing in the covers, and the new slips on our book were trimmed neatly, but only after they were laced in, so they would have been much longer to make it possible and easy to lace them through the holes in the cover, which suggests that the binder or binders who attached the covers of these two small books were not responsible for the sewing of the books, or they wouldn't have sewn them in this way. But because the books were very small, it may have been decided that the emband slips were all that were needed to hold them together. This is very unusual for an English lace case limp binding of this period, and I know of only one example of English covers attached only by their emband slips out of the 154 limp parchment bindings that I have recorded, and the many more that I have seen. That's completely English bindings. And it suggests that the English binder or binders responsible for these two covers deviated from their usual practice only when faced with already sewn book blocks. The binder, therefore, who attached the cover of our books perhaps thought that the weight of a rather thick octavo was such that extra strength was needed, and therefore attached the strips of alum-tawed skin to the Flemish sewing supports to provide additional slips to lace through the cover. This is the result of his being faced with a sewn book block imported into England from Antwerp, let us suppose, and then asked to put it into a cover by a bookseller or its first owner, we don't know who, of course, and then converting that structure into a structure which would work with the typical English cover. Now, the reconstruction of the history of this book is, of course, purely hypothetical, and until we have much more precise information about regional practices, it will be hard to prove such hypotheses. But this humble-looking book clearly has an unexpectedly complex history, and provides a very good example of what you might find if you're able to go undercover when examining a binding. Now, I'm fortunate in this case, the book was almost in pieces when I bought it, but it is possible to work much of this out through in books which are in much better condition. They're not impossible to investigate in this way without damaging them, of course. What we then have to do is try to interpret what we find, and I think we are likely to come up with some quite interesting conclusions when we are able to do that. Thank you very much.